Uh, I'm Caitlin Rogger. I'm from Greater Washington. I'm joined by Stephanie Gidigbi-Jenkins and Beth Osborne, whom I'll introduce in a moment. This is the second installment in our series on transportation dynamics in the Washington region and implications for future transportation planning. And tiny housekeeping mention, this session is being recorded. Today's discussion will focus on, in the first webinar, we had Leah Brooks from George Washington University. And she was talking to my colleague, Alex Baca, about the big picture of transportation patterns in the region and how those have been evolving. And today's discussion will be focusing on a few specific dynamics, both long-term kind of realities, both in terms of people's lived experience and the kind of broader inequality trends we've seen, and then emerging dynamics more recently, both from COVID and other kind of current trends. After that, we'll be taking questions from the audience. I want to thank Bloomberg Philanthropies and the American Cities Climate Challenge for the grant support that enables us to hold this webinar series today. So today's panel, super excited, these are both leaders who have inspired a lot of my thinking around transportation policy. We have Stephanie Gidigbi-Jenkins, who's Director of Policy and Partnerships at the Natural Resources Defense Council, which is an office here in DC. And until recently, Stephanie was a member of WMATA's Board of Directors. Prior to that, she worked for DDOT, the US DOT under the Obama administration's Ladders of Opportunity Economic Development Opportunity Agenda. Beth Osborne is Director of Transportation for America, a national advocacy organization based here in DC. And before that, worked at the US DOT as Acting Assistant Secretary for Transportation Policy. I practiced that a couple of times. We are just so lucky to have this concentration of policy expertise right here on our doorstep. Oh, and I'm Caitlin Rogger. I'm Deputy Director of Greater Washington and also Executive Director of DC Sustainable Transportation. So let's kick off thinking about the long-term kind of dynamics that are driving transportation equity in the Washington region. We've got about a few topics to kind of go through on that. I'm going to get some thoughts from the discussants as we talk through those. Firstly, thinking about who rides transit. I've got this slide here from the Bus Transformation Project from WMATA a couple of years back. In it, you can see some pretty obvious dynamics around, folks who are using transit, both bus customers and residents who are using bus in particular. I'd love to just get some initial thoughts from Stephanie and Beth, on the makeup of transit ridership, and is that the right way to think about it? Is it a group of people, or is it a kind of ebbing flow? And maybe Stephanie, we could start off with you.
Sure, and maybe I'll just say thank you for having me. One of the things that I'm bringing to this conversation is my full self. So while you talked about a lot of the places that I've worked, I also am a transit rider. I am and fully understand the impacts of a lot of the decisions that have been made by the region. And so when we look at who rides transit, I think one of the things that we should separate out is just the reality between Metro Bus and Metro Rail. And I think that when you look at this chart, you get to see that the discussions that we have as it relates to bus across the region comparatively to our rail system is one where you can see the inequities really based off of those who are minority, non-white, right? Being able to have a conversation about those who are low income, very specifically those who have English as a second language as their lived experience as part of it. You would also think that, especially when we have the conversation in terms of just growth and walkable communities, that it would be young people, but they actually are not in that demographic shift in the same way. A lot of the concern is really based off of just maybe a car conversation or even a rail conversation comparatively to a bus conversation. And so it's important that when we talk about transit, because I think that it gets lumped in together, that at least for me, one of the things that I talked about very explicitly during my time on the board is that I felt like we had two separate and unequal systems as it relates to Metro Bus versus Metro Rail. And it was something that I prioritized in really being able to ensure that we advanced a lot of the work that Greater Washington and the greater coalitions worked on, and making sure that the plan that was put in place to address bus standardization was critical as part of the discussion.
Thanks, Stephanie. Beth, any further thoughts on that?
I don't know how to add to that. I think Stephanie covered so much that's really important. And I'm just gonna say, me too.
In that case, we're going to switch on to a slide I actually filched from Stephanie about access to cars. This was handy. Sorry, it's a little bit blurry here, but this is a quick visual on transit riders and their access to cars. And this was during the pandemic, but I think the dynamics are similar. And maybe we can go back to Stephanie then and just what story do you think this visual is telling us?
Yeah, so this comes from Transit App. One of the things that they really do is focus on real-time data and how it relates to the region. It was one of the things that I looked to early on in the pandemic to just really see who was implicated by the decisions that we were making as a board. And one of the things that I think is very clearly described here is just the reality and the dichotomy between the economics, right, for the region, right? Those who are making less than even up to, $50,000 a year have a different lived experience in terms of their access to a car and making different choices, right, as part of this. And those who are more in the 150 plus range, while they may not have a car, they have access to a car, so they can make different choices. And I think that as the Metro had to shut down just because of the nature of the pandemic early on last year. And even now, as we're seeing what is happening with the Series 7,000 pieces, those who are impacted are those who are most transit dependent in a lot of ways. And I think that it offers a space for us to really think about how do you make more informed choices with this data? How do you ensure that the dollars that are coming through, how it should be spent? I think it raises the question on just the importance of good public transit as essential for all workers, just because of those who are most dependent on making it work and making our region work.
Yeah, this is really reminiscent of my own experience. When I grew up in Louisiana, I went to school in Baton Rouge, and I desperately needed work to pay my bills, but couldn't find a job that I could reach if I didn't have a car, and I couldn't afford to buy a car because I couldn't already pay my bills if I couldn't get a job. And when I moved to DC, now I moved to DC in the 90s, so DC was a very different place then. It was a refuge for me. At the time, people with money weren't moving into the city, and I could afford to go get a really affordable place very close to transit. And I was lucky enough, just due to the circumstance of when I moved here, to buy into Columbia Heights before it went completely off the rails. But the thing is, more and more people wanted to make the same decision as I did, but we didn't keep up with the demand. We didn't create more communities like this to meet the demand. And that's happened across the country. And if you are keeping the supply for something down here while the demand grows, the only people that will have access to it by design in a free market economy are people with money. This is how the diamond trade works. Diamonds are ubiquitous, but the diamond industry harvests them and holds them away from the public so that they cost a lot when they go out. We need to get away from that, and we have to recognize that this is a bigger issue than just transit agencies. The way we design our communities dictate whether or not we are giving people affordable access to jobs and essential services. And that means developing neighborhoods where the things you need are close to you, places are walkable and easily served by transit in the first place.
Mm-hmm. I want to hit on that point, just one more piece to that, which is also, I think pre-pandemic, there was a full conversation around, the suburbanization of poverty. And I think that across the region, what we see is that people are still being pushed out. And just that reality of like, the further you are, the less access that you have, right? And so just the reality of like, and those who are further out also don't have access to a car. So how are we building our transit system to kind of address the needs that are showing up, and not just the transit system, but just making sure that we have more accessible access for the greater region?
Yeah, I think those are really interesting points, especially as we consider we're moving into this, economic recovery period, and how will those differential access levels kind of pan out. Just moving on to thinking about, the impacts of inequity. We've got a slide here from Transit Center's equity dashboard, which they released earlier this year, and GG Wash helped develop. Jobs accessible within 45 minutes, you can see some fairly stark differentials here in terms of different groups and how quickly they can get to jobs via transit. Jobs are not the only thing. Commutes are not the only types of transportation pattern, but I do think it's kind of like a part of the puzzle. And I'd just be interested sort of in your thoughts on, the problems that these disparities create, whether that's the differential transit trip times for commuters or for people doing other kinds of trips. Beth.
Sure. Yeah, in terms of those other kinds of trips, it's always been very frustrating to me the extent to which we focus on jobs. It defines most of our highway policy and roadway policy. We build them for the peak on the work trip. And we've done the same thing for transit, because our entire transportation program is focused on one trip that makes up about 20% of our trips and 30% of the miles driven, because it tends to be a longer trip. But the non-work trip is actually what's associated with things like how much you have to spend on transportation. The non-work trip, so the grocery and school and medical care and retail and restaurants and parks and banks and all those things, those trips are more associated with public health outcomes, with how much you emit, with how many cars you own, with how much you drive. Those are the trips that really you find are particularly challenging for the single parent. It's not getting to and from work. It's getting to and from work while dropping your kids off at daycare or school and picking them up and running by the grocery and all. The system's not designed for those trips which tend to be the shortest trips and should be the most easy to serve. But if you go across the country, you'll find that, it's impossible to cross streets safely to the grocery. I remember living in Baton Rouge again. I lived 2 doors down from the grocery and had to drive it. That is the sort of thing that I'd really like us to focus on. And I'd really like to use the pandemic, where we had to focus on those other trips more than work, as an excuse to rethink all of transportation, but particularly transit. Transit will have a very different look for the non-work trip. You're going to see more of a small circulation through a community rather than all the lines going to a job center or downtown, like a hub and spoke sort of system. So I think it's a great opportunity to revisit it. And there's really good reason why we always should have looked at it differently. So this is a very important opportunity for us.
Building upon some of the things that Beth spoke to, one of the things that I'll just say WMATA spent some time talking about is that reality, around the off-peak trips. What we know now is about 80% essentially of those trips are happening outside of that commuter hour, that folks have been doing that even before the pandemic. And that's the other piece. I think that a lot of this discussion, 2020 brought to light many of the things that we turned a blind eye to. And so even the notion of peak trips was something that was happening before the pandemic, in terms of the shifts that we were seeing. But I think that it offers a space for us to have a different conversation as to how do we ensure that our transit system is thinking about some of those pieces. Beth mentioned a really interesting piece in terms of just single family homes. And I think or single reality homes. And so even just seeing that the single mother piece in terms of the impact of inequality that you see here is one that is like very real, right? The notion of just the weeknight service, that was something that we really had to struggle with as we were thinking about how late we needed the transit system to be open, and offering kind of bus service to stand in the gap while the rail system wasn't necessarily providing some of those pieces. I think the other piece that I think is really important are kind of three major themes as it relates to this impact of inequality. One piece is really around frequency and speed. Just the reality that those who are low income, those who are more transit dependent on Metro bus or in bus in general in the region have a different lived experience as it relates to the time cost to be able to ride the system, right? It just takes longer to ride the bus. And in part, because the transit agencies don't control the roads, right? So there are other pieces that government will need to play its role to ensure that there are dedicated bus lanes and other pieces to make those commutes faster. But that time is one that we can't get back, and we all have the same 24 hours that we're trying to negotiate, right? That reliability piece is a second major component in terms of the impact of inequality. The reality that folks are not sure if that bus is going to show up on time. And one of the bigger pieces that hit me early in the pandemic was just literally my neighbor, she wake up for the 6 o'clock bus and she was standing outside and it wasn't showing up. Like days after everything happened, you know, folks got on the bus that morning or took the train, but particularly was Metro bus. And when they were getting ready to leave, it wasn't there. And in part, we had to make different choices just because of protecting our employees and some of those pieces at the time for the board. So it was a very tough place. But that reliability, you know, the fact that there's a promise for Metro Rail, but that same promise wasn't offered to Metro Bus says a lot. And I'm not just focusing on Metro. It's in part my lived experience serving on the board, but I think that you see that across all of the bus systems that the region provides in both Maryland and Virginia. The other piece that I'll just highlight is the affordability that then comes with this. And I think affordability is often just on transit fare conversations, but I think that again, time is a real cost that we don't account for that should be a factor when we talk about the inequalities that we see in this region and who is able to make different choices because they have access to a car, access to rideshare opportunities when the train or the bus is not running at the same speed. This most recent impact as it relates to just, and I name the reality of what's going on with the transit system, not to put blame. It's a very hard place that the board and, the leadership team is having to navigate in this moment because we're also trying to balance safety priorities, but these are all factors that come into play when we start to have some decisions on where we want to spend our dollars.
And I know that I already had my time, but Stephanie reminded me of an exercise we did with some public policy makers in the DMV, and we had folks plan a trip for a parent, maybe with a disabled spouse or a single parent whose car was out of order, and they had to. We actually designed, we gave the person an address, we named the school that they had to drop a kid off of, whether I went and did research to find out if they actually do have before care or after care. We found a local area, if you could even get into it, with daycare, and made folks plan their non-driving trip to work. We identified a place where a person with less income, less experience, and less education could legitimately find work in the area and put it as close as we could. It was amazing how hard the trip home was. And that was we were assuming the bus, and it was almost always the bus, came on time, was in order, was not full. It was an extraordinary eye-opening experience. You could barely piece together the morning. If everything went right, the afternoon was impossible.
Mm-hmm. I want to emphasize one more piece on that point, because this is why representation matters. Because, I think for me, during my tenure on the board, it just happened. It wasn't always the case, but I was the only woman, only person of color, and essentially only transit rider during the pandemic. It was, in many cases, the worst case scenario, but also I felt fortunate because I had board members who could listen to my lived experience and incorporate that in their decision making. But it does speak to why you have to have folks who have this lived experience, who have and rely on, transit. And I'm really encouraged by the board new composition. I think we have a new balance on gender and also just demographics. But this is really a big piece in terms of being able to just offer greater insight from a leadership perspective.
Mm-hmm. And I think we're really fortunate from the DC side to have, two women on the board with you and Lucinda Babers, and then now with Tracy Lowe as well. I think that's promising, and we need to do more. And yeah, but going in the right direction. Next slide kind of deals with some of the topics you've touched on quickly, but I want to give you another crack at thinking about pricing, because you both alluded to the different costs that can be apportioned to riders that are beyond that point of service cost. We tend to think about the cost of transportation being, your gas or your metro fare or your bike, like the direct kind of costs, but I'm also interested in how we price it more broadly. You talked about the complexity of the trip, about the length of the trip. Are there other costs and other kind of ways we are actually incentivizing certain modes over other ones in the DMV? Just interested in any other thoughts on that.
Maybe one more piece, a couple more pieces. I started to talk about the suburbanization of poverty, but I think that there's like 3 aspects, and I actually will, there's a great guy in the planning office, Sham, who has done a lot of this work for WMATA, but really talks about this notion of choice move. I think the pandemic has allowed people to make different choices as to where they may want to really live moving forward, right? And I think that reality means that you have the choice to have a greater walk to the transit and what that looks like in terms of being able to be, 3/4 of a mile out to gain access to getting around outside of having to drive. I think the reality around this region and being priced out and the cost of what that means and what that means to get back into the city and do a lot of these essential jobs that we've been cheerleading all throughout the pandemic. And now as the dollars are flowing through, the decisions that will be made. And again, I'm excited by a lot of the decisions that this board has most recently adopted. And then I think the final piece is just that notion of driving to qualify for specific homes, housings, and opportunities for transportation choices and what that looks like. So, these are real factors. I also recognize the reality around if and when people return back to work, it has completely shifted what downtown looks like and what that might mean for just a business economic standpoint, and how do we offer greater transportation choices for folks who want to make that move back.
Yeah.
I will add, Stephanie pointed out the importance of lived experiences and how much they differ. The experience of people with fewer resources can be very different. And sometimes the decision making might surprise those of us that are not forced to make the decisions that others are. There's the cost of living in a place that requires every person over 16 to have their own car to be able to accomplish anything. They're pricing out the whole cost of life. We're pricing out the value of the rent, which, look, rent is big, but it's not the only expense. And, there are plenty of people that have no choice but to get by with one car for multiple people. Mm-hmm. And they have to move someplace where that is possible. We talked about time, but I also think really involving the populations that you're trying to take, to take into consideration. I remember hearing that low-income people would never be able to take advantage of things like Uber and Lyft. When my kids were at a school that was 90% low income, reduced or free lunch students, and I can't tell you the number of Ubers and Lyfts that people had to use to get to their kids on time. Mm-hmm. And so I just think it's super important when we think about the cost of all this to talk to people about what they mean by cost and not just make the assumption that the only thing that they're looking at is transit fare or a congestion pricing. You know, is this impacting them? How are they traveling? And really understanding what it means person by person.
Yeah. Those are great points. Thank you so much. I'm going to, just to make sure we have some time for Q&A, I'm going to shift us now. We've been talking about long-term realities. I'm going to shift us to think about emerging dynamics. We've had a couple interesting years, you could say, starting with the COVID pandemic. We've had WMATA's experiencing some great difficulties. Want to move into associated issues with both of those matters. So I want to start off thinking about health and safety. You've got a few different ways you could look at health and safety right now and people's considerations about transportation. We could start thinking, first what I've put up here is our Vision Zero goal in DC, for example. Very sadly over the weekend, we had yet another death due to traffic violence. And we've had many this year. This is 37 for us. And so while people are considering their transportation choices, bearing in mind that, we've got not just deaths, we've got thousands of injuries, both major and minor, that factors into the equity piece. Well, not the equity piece, but how equity kind of filters throughout so many different aspects of transportation, because we know that those are more likely to fall on terms of lower income and Black and Brown communities. At the same time, there's another health piece around COVID. People's considerations around public transit may have changed, even though we know from the data that the risk on public transit is relatively low. People are having concerns about any time spent in the public sphere. So I'd just be really interested your perspectives. Are the kind of health, are the health pieces, safety pieces, are they kind of widening disparities? How are they interacting with these long-term realities you've been describing?
We have known, my organization's put out a report every 2 years called Dangerous by Design. And we have recognized that the places where the fatalities are most likely to happen are on urban or suburban arterial roadways, particularly off-peak. And there's a lot that's packed into that statement. One is when we look at the way we design those arterials, we're designing them to accommodate highway-like speeds, except when we built the interstate highway system, we knew darn well that those speeds do not belong anywhere near development. Mm-hmm. And then we went and built the highways completely separated and then imported that design onto our local roadways. Mm-hmm. It is fundamentally dangerous. And we still have, even with the lowering of speed limits, we still have a whole lot of roadways that are not really lowered in speed limit, and they're not lowered in design. They're wide open. And what happened over COVID is we got rid of our single greatest safety intervention, which is traffic congestion. The thing we're constantly trying to fix is the one thing slowing down traffic, which is why fatalities often happen off peak. We lost our peak and we lost the slowness of travel when most people are moving around. Mm-hmm. So I think we're going to have to come to grips with the fact that where there are conflicts in terms of driveways and crossroads and people taking lefts and people taking rights and bikes and scooters and transit and people, that you just have to go slower. And until we really embrace that, we're not going to see a real Vision Zero approach.
This one feels personal for me. So one of the things that we know is that your zip code has more of a determining factor of your life expectancy than your genetic code. So we know that place matters and where you live matters. It was interesting on the day that we allowed for folks to celebrate, safe routes to school and walking. Here, I live in Ward 8 in the Congress Heights neighborhood. There was a father who was injured in addition to his 2 children, literally down the street from my house. It is the same street that I walk on with my newborn and my husband. And it is the reality that, very specifically Wheeler Road it is one of the most dangerous intersections within the district. And it in part is because of that speed piece. The other reality though that I hold as a tension is just the this is a broader conversation that I'm going to raise, but this is really just the over-policing of Black spaces. I think one of the other things that George Floyd in 2020 brought to light was just the impact in terms of just walking, arrested development, arrested mobility, as Charles Brown often talks about, this reality of just like driving while Black and what it means in terms of the implications. So even those who do happen to have a car, they're going to be, particularly if you're a person of color, lower income, they're going to be a used car. They don't have the privilege of this EV infrastructure conversation that is now emerging, right? And so there may be a need for greater repairs, and that means that you're going to have a frequency and stops, and that also means a cost of your life in a very different way for the conversations that are happening. The fines and fees that we use to pay for a lot of our transit pieces, particularly in the district, comes from, parking times and pieces like that. It's a very challenging policy discussion to have when we really think about what safety means. Also, just who has access to a sidewalk, that there are places intentionally built so that you do not walk in those neighborhoods for a reason. And what that means in terms of that lack of physical infrastructure, particularly for those who may be needing to get in to provide those essential services because they may be lower paid jobs in those neighborhoods or areas, but the access for who may be allowed to be in that neighborhood is the different lived reality. And I think you see that very specifically in certain parts of the district and across Virginia and Maryland. I think the final piece for me is just really thinking about what that looks like, because a lot of our conversation has been on the transit side, but when you start to think about that road user piece, you really start to see a very different reality and just the cost of what it means to drive in terms of just your life and being a person of color. So this piece is one that, beyond Vision Zero, beyond what it means in terms of just being able to have bike infrastructure, it's a hard challenge, especially if you feel like these infrastructure improvements are not necessarily being made for you. The need for also being able to get to where you need to go to safely is one that puts policymakers in a very tough space.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we had an interesting conversation in my ANC meeting just last night about, who are bike lanes for? And actually the discussion we were having was about age and older residents kind of feeling uncertain about it. And then there were kind of a couple arguments around, not arguments, but discussions around, making it safer on the one hand, makes it more possible for older cyclists. I know my parents are in their mid-70s and really won't cycle outside of a protected lane. But at the same time, if you're seeing it everywhere, how is that kind of impacting your perception of the landscape, and how can we bring people along and ensure that services and infrastructure are accessible to them?
And how hard it must be, especially if you're a legacy resident, to see that you've been asking for specific road improvements to be made to just traffic calming mechanisms for years, just basic speed bumps, okay? And then now seeing that whole lanes and new pieces are being built for folks to come through your community. I think that's just a very hard discussion. And I sit in that tension space as someone who advocates for a lot of variations of those policies.
Mm-hmm. And I have to say, it's both really frustrating that we have to point this out. I mean, we have truly built the roadways to help people get through Black and brown communities because they are labeled as dangerous. I mean, look, that's what's really going on. The folks that leapfrogged out further out want to get through there as fast as possible. And that's why those roadways were designed that way. The folks who live close by were not the consideration. But fixing this is so simple in so many ways. You can make huge changes with very little investment. You don't have to come in with a massive change, and you don't have to start with a massive change. You can make very mild, small spot improvements to engage the public and get a sense of what they really need and how they use the city, and have them be a part of the design of that roadway going forward. Around my kids' school in Columbia Heights, they just made they extended the curb with delineators. And in doing so, slowed down traffic overnight, and it cost so little to do. And then engage the public in what that felt like and what the impact was. It really, we know how to do it. It's so easy to do, and yet it seems to be so hard to make the case. And I am befuddled by that.
So speaking of befuddlements, moving to WMATA, which I had to hold myself back from calling it WMATA, this slide. We all have hope for the future. Just thinking about WMATA, it's the backbone of our transportation system in the region. Just as rail ridership was starting to kind of creep back up, we've had this blow in terms of the 7,000 series being taken out of commission for a while for safety reasons, affecting tens of thousands of trips. What do you think are the kind of impacts on equity on something like this? What is this, a short-term kind of impact? Could this have longer ramifications? I'm talking about impact on transportation equity.
This one is a hard one because I feel like there were so many amazing policies that also got announced, like literally like in September. It was like the transfer fee penalties were being removed. The frequency service network was being improved. Like all of the things that like, it was like, yes. And then we went back to like 30-minute, 45-minute trips on Metro Rail. And again, I think it speaks to, I just want to be able to hold the tension around the discussion between Metro Rail and Metro Bus. It's the same folks who were impacted during the pandemic that are also feeling this impact now, which is those who are most transit dependent. And so how do we just make sure that we're making more equitable investments with this money that's going to potentially come through that really kind of thinks about some of these pieces? You know, one of the things that I am processing in real time is that you can't put new cars on a legacy system and think that it's going to offer the same outcomes. And I think about the amount of money that's about to go into communities in legacy systems that have the same roads that reflected policies from the 1960s and say that we're making major investments. We're going to get derailed. And so I think it's important for us to have a very different type of conversation in this moment. Not just for WMATA. I think WMATA is Metro's raising, the challenge that it's facing right now is raising a larger tension, which is how do we also address the legacy systems, the legacy of a system, and being able to make sure that we're spending our money in the right spaces and for those who are most in need.
Yeah, I mean, I also have to, point out that the ridership rebounded more quickly on the buses because, as we pointed out, the rail lines were not the ones that were, serving lower income populations to the extent that buses were. And so, I don't know how big of an impact. Stephanie is a much better person to ask about this. I mean, I can tell you it impacted me, but I'm not the folks, without choice. My kids take the train to school and my husband takes it to work. I go to my basement, so I don't have to take anything but my own 2 feet. I'm very much hoping to see it rebound in December as we'll start going back into work more, and I know there will be demand for those lines, but it does kind of remind me to look again at those buses and how much faster they were used and how incredibly important they are and why they need to get equal attention to the trains.
I want to bring up something that Beth is also emphasizing, which is the ability for choice and the decision of whether you get to go back to work or not. And I think that is a huge factor that I don't know that folks are fully accounting for from a place of privilege, that there are folks who can very much look at this reality that's happening with the 700 series and say, I'm going to make a different choice. And I'm not going to wait. I'm not going to hold the cost that is attached to spending my time waiting for the next train to arrive. And there are other folks who that is not an option. They have to get to work. They have to physically show up. And that is a very real reality that we also need to account for, which is the privilege. And so as we think about how these investments then are made, like really thinking about what that means broadly for those who, again, are most transit dependent, who don't have car access, or access to multiple transportation choices, don't have the economic, the money to really pay for different decision making.
So I'm going to try to move us on to quickly talk about the federal funding. It's a big news. Well, I'm raising my hands in excitement, but it's kind of a medium, as we know. There's some good things and some not so great things. Maybe we just spend a few minutes on that and then go over to Q&A, because I know there are several from the audience. Got here a figure that shows, vast majority of the funding going to roads and bridges. I know there's a lot of money kind of shoring up our existing highway system. There's some funding for rail. I know Transportation for America had a piece describing that as kind of the silver lining, as it were. There's a whack of funding for public transit. When you look at these figures, maybe I could ask for both of your top line thoughts about, is there still an opportunity, even though this doesn't get quite what was originally hoped for out of the infrastructure bill in terms of focus on public transit and mode shift? Are there still some wins for equity, especially sustainable transportation and equity that for the region out of this funding, and what would kind of determine that?
To a great extent, this bill is doubling down on or tripling down on the status quo, which means the decision is in the hand of the region's DOTs. And they have the same program that they could have opted to use for equity before this bill. It's just much, much bigger. So do we have opportunity? Yes. The control is in the hands of the state DOTs to a great extent. There are things that USDOT can use in terms of their administrative actions and the bully pulpit to push things in that direction. And so there's great opportunity there as well. There is also certainly more funding for transit and a lot of funding for rail, which is very exciting. There's the non-transportation side, which I think deserves a ton of attention, like replacement of lead pipes and things like that will be extraordinarily important. But I think the deal is, this is money. And if I'm a transit rider, we just talked about the danger of getting to transit and moving the transit along the roadways. It means that that money for roads and bridges is as important to transit as the transit spending. So we need to make sure that money is spent well. And all the DOTs have all the authority in the world to spend it with goals to supporting those biking and walking, to making the roads safer, to reconnecting neighborhoods. But they had that before too. So it's on those of us that want to hold them accountable to make sure that they use their flexibility to reach better outcomes than they have in the past.
I would just emphasize a most recent piece covered in the New York Times that quoted Beth, but just talked about this notion around the impact of just racial equity as it relates to the dollars that are being spent. Just offering a historical context, our infrastructure system, particularly the interstate highway, was built pre-civil rights movement items. So we intentionally divided communities in many places based off of race and class. And so all of this money that's being made available is building on that legacy to some extent. And so unless folks are intentionally doing something different, we're going to continue to have the same outcomes. One of my favorite quotes that I often use from MLK is the moral arc of the universe. He's not the one who did it, but he's made it famous. The moral arc of the universe bends towards justice. And it requires all of us to be arc benders. It requires us to do the work. It requires us to raise the issues. It requires us to hold government officials accountable. And it's more than just the states. It is the mayors, it's the elected officials, it is community groups to show up and have the conversations. It is the accountability of watchdogs. It is like it requires all of us to allow for this to work. And so while there is a level of excitement that I have in seeing this level of investment, it is in part because there are a lot of flexible options to do something different. And I'm hoping that folks will choose to do something different. There's one other piece that I just will highlight that Beth didn't talk about, but I think is a big win to me, which is the Reconnecting Communities pilot grant. It is literally $1 billion in this larger 300+ piece so it's not that much money. But what I will say, in places like the 11th Street Bridge, and in many places across DC where we've seen the impacts of lack of, or the implications of a transportation system that may or may not have been built in certain neighborhoods, the lack of connecting and bridging the divide in communities, particularly between, you know, Southeast and, you know, the broader DC district, I think is an opportunity for us to really kind of think about some of these investments that make more equitable outcomes. I would also just make one other final piece, which is this investment also creates economic development investments for neighborhoods, and it also has huge implications for displacement. And so it's also important for us to think about, because of the level of funding that is being offered, we have to really also think about the policies that need to be undergirding some of these challenges, because by this level of investment in transit, it also means that it's increasing value. And while the issue of increased value is not necessarily a bad thing, the displacement and loss of culture is. And so being able to just highlight and raise those realities are also things that only the local governments can do, just because of the land use function that it serves.
And I would like to add that I love the reconnecting communities concept. I'm very happy to see it's in here. I'm suspicious of the notion that this is the foothold and then it can grow, because that's not the history of programs like this. They tend to stay small. And my fear, look, we were very much involved in the development of this concept with Senator Carper's office, but we also proposed a strong anti-displacement portion of this bill, which did not make it in. And we also proposed a big change to the way we do modeling, because of my experience when I was at USDOT, and we funded a study of the takedown of the Claiborne Expressway in my hometown of New Orleans and the Sheridan Expressway in New York. And the models showed that when people lost their expressway, they would then choose to travel 10 miles per hour down one-way streets. Because the model's so flawed, it has no choice but to keep people in the corridor. It cannot envision a world where people shift modes or shift corridors or shift times of day and travel, or just don't travel. Maybe they order instead. And those parts are missing from that. And at the same time, that big $110 billion number has some really troublesome projects in that will displace significantly more people of color than the communities can be reconnected by the Reconnecting Communities program. So we really need to focus on the way the highway dollars are spent and not stay focused on the little fix-it programs, because we don't want to dig a hole so deeply that, you know, all we're doing is refilling that hole with a teaspoon.
Right. Thank you. These are sage words for the next few years, I think, for us all to keep in mind. Going to move to Q&A. There are some excellent questions in the chat. Oh, sorry, that was too fast. Q&A. And I'll just pull off the stop share for that. I think what I'll ask is that we maybe focus on maybe just a minute or two on each question if we can, so we can try to get a few of these. First question I'm seeing, reduced fare and free fare programs have potentials to address a lot of the equity issues discussed here, but one major challenge is to maintain the same or expand services to meet the needs of off-peak essential workers trips. Thoughts? Essential workers, they carried us through this pandemic in so many ways. I don't know about you, but I was looking around going, are we going to have municipal services next week? You know, back in spring 2020. And we did. We had grocery stores, we had municipal services. Everyone had a hard time, but that was pretty amazing to see that keep up. And bus was the way that those folks got to work.
No, it's totally right. And free and reduced fare programs are great. Again, I think we have to be a little more nuanced in how we judge cost. Because if we are trading off frequency for reduced fares, we're not helping people out necessarily. So we need to put it all together. Ideally, we'd have fabulous frequency and free fares. And I hope we can make it there, but I do want to make sure we're looking at the true lived experience of folks that are trying to get where they need to go. And a free fare that, you know, for a bus that comes every 30 minutes is not what they're asking for. So we just need to be very thoughtful in measuring that access, that whole trip, which we don't do in transportation. We've really worked on helping people use the same technology you use on Apple Maps or Google Maps or any of those sorts of things to determine your whole trip. And we just need to bring that into transit and highways to make sure we're really thinking about the full experience.
Mm-hmm.
And I just have to call out just like the coalition that really worked on the bus transformation study, because I do think that that frequency of service piece is a big element of this conversation of reliability in addition to the affordability. And, you know, I do think that it is important for us to kind of think about what that balance looks like, especially because we're really, from a collection rate, we're not really gaining that much more in terms of money. So like, let's really think about how do we then improve service, because I think that that will make hopefully bus more on par to rail with options, especially because folks are just literally, the majority of those trips are just trying to get in there around their neighborhood, but the lines don't add up in that way. And to the extent that you had greater frequency, greater reliability, that you could just take that bus. And I think that that's where, you know, the circulators, that was the purpose of the circulators, was to help to meet some of those goals. We need to continue a lot of that investment still.
Frequency and reliability are they're the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 priorities, and we don't spend enough time talking about those two things.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, want to go now to, we talked a little bit about the community input piece, and we had a question: how can the discussion relating to asking the users for input into key issues incorporate aspirational aspects of life, the constraints encountered in achieving the dreams as imagined by the public? I'm going to interpret that a little bit. I mean, the way I'm interpreting it is thinking again about my sort of local ANC and sort of how sometimes there's a tension between folks not wanting to lose, but also, you know, getting folks' heads around what we all stand to gain, and the future could be better in some ways. And so I know that that can have kind of tinges of promises that don't come realized, but it's also how we kind of need to think about the future is aspirationally. So any responses to that?
I would just say that there is no aspiration without clear targets and outcomes. And I think in transportation, we do ourselves a disservice when we all see ourselves in every spending bill, rather than really looking at the patterns of spending and seeing if they match up with our hopes. I see people, you know, using the same words, even a word as ubiquitous as congestion, meaning utterly different things. And so I think we need to be very clear about what it is we're trying to achieve. And when our elected officials get up and say, you know, throw the word safety around, you know, we need to make sure that we agree on what we're talking about. What exactly is the objective? What are the ways to get to it? And hold them accountable for delivering it. In transportation, I just see everyone get excited about money, or a mode or a technology. These are tools. These are not policies. And we really need to think about the policies that feed into how that money is used, how that mode is deployed, or those projects are developed. And we need to look at the outcomes and not be afraid to say when people are blowing it.
And, you know, one of the things, what's cool about this is Beth and I both got a chance to work at DOT at the same time. We overlapped, and during the time that she was there, I was doing more on the public engagement side. And I think that the reality is, it is that level of feedback of the lived experience, recognizing that a lot of the representation on the boards and in the decision-making bodies may not have those pieces that are critical. And I think that for years, you know, Greater Washington was a space where you could get kind of a different balance of what was happening and its implications. And so I do think that it's going to be really important for folks to really show up and talk about why the decisions that are made need to be part of it. I felt like in my time on the board, I was able to cover a lot of different issues, but one of the areas that I know and wish I would have done a little bit more on was really on the accessibility conversation. I think even something like that, access, is one of those terms where we're defining access in terms of choice versus like ADA accessibility as two different realities, and what paratransit means versus bus transit is just also a different lived experience and reality. And those are folks who really depend on the system in a very different way. So I think that being able to define what we mean when we were talking about things like infrastructure, I never thought that that could be a word that had so many different meanings, and now we're even talking about social infrastructure, you know, is going to be important. And I think being able to bring the lived experience about why the work matters is going to be crucial. I think just thinking about the study from the transit center and the reality that we were talking about, what single mothers were going through and what that lived experience was, is one that is not often part of the factor discussion pieces that we equate for. And so just being able to offer some of these perspectives, I think, helps at the end of the day, I think everyone is doing the best that they can where they are, and it doesn't mean that we can't do more. And what I will say for a lot of the board members, when I was able to offer kind of the lived experience of other groups and bringing it to the discussion, they were able to make different choices with me. And so, you know, I think a lot was able to be achieved in part because I was able to bring a lot of those voices to the table with me, even being kind of the soul in many of those checkbox pieces from a demographics perspective.
Mm-hmm. Got a question about, we're going to try to cover at least a couple more questions here. Question about transit labor. Is transit labor being engaged as stakeholders to help advocate for better transit and transit equity? Are the unions being incorporated into the discussions? Have you caught wind of that at all?
I work in a transit coalition that includes the unions. They've been very active in, you know, keeping the new transit programs in the Build Back Better bill. Also worked a lot with them through COVID to make sure that emergency funds went to transit. We stepped in really early and fought very hard along with the unions and some equity advocates and NRDC and many others to make sure that there was funding flowing through those emergency spending bills to keep transit running, no matter how few people were riding, because we knew those were the essential workers that we needed, that we all relied on. Didn't really help to drive yourself to the airport if there were no nurses, techs, or, you know, other essential workers there. So I think that COVID really put us, created quite a test, but the transit supporters out there really did come together and have been working quite closely. Now, in terms of what's going on with local efforts, I have not been as directly involved in conversations within WMATA. I would leave that to Stephanie.
I would just say, you know, putting on my NRDC hat, we're part of the Blue-Green Alliance that speaks a lot to some of the labor pieces, and they were critical aspects for making sure that this bill was done. I think yesterday was a showcase of a lot of those pieces on the South Lawn. More specifically, though, I think that operations fund and what that meant in terms of the American Recovery Act, the COVID funds that were made available was in part to make sure that we could ensure that we were keeping our employees. We were last December was real when we were talking about cuts bringing us back to the 1990s system because we did not have the money. Being able to have conversations with a lot of the operators, bus operators, about what that means for even our decisions and then what it meant to the region. Like, I don't think that people fully understand that when Metro is making certain decisions, it also impacts the other bus systems across the region and how they want to show up. So our policy decisions in just one system actually kind of really does impact the others. And it, even having everyone sit at the table and talk about what some of those implications are, don't always happen. So, you know, I think we talk about labor, but moreover, the people who are helping to ensure that transit is available is not often part of the conversation. And I think we saw a lot of those layoffs being a real threat that we had to really balance out. And it was why we had to make some of the service cuts to make sure that we were protecting our employees as part of that discussion. And I say employees just as a former board member, but in general, just transit systems and what that meant across the country that we were seeing.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. We had a lot of great questions we didn't get a chance to get to, folks. This has been such an engaging discussion, and I've really enjoyed it. I want to thank our panelists. We are at time. Beth Osborne, Stephanie Gidigbi-Jenkins. It's been just tremendous hearing your thoughts on these key issues. I think we've realized this could have been its own 3-part series. Next year, maybe, who knows? But thank you, and thank you to our audience members for your great questions, for your engagement. Hope you can join us for our next installment of the webinar series that will be coming up in a few weeks, and we'll be sending out information about that. And yes, a big thank you again, and wishing you all a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.